Cool. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to my talk this afternoon. I appreciate that. For those of you who got lost on the way to .NET Rocks, we've locked the doors, so you can't change now. So today, I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things I'm pretty passionate about, Blazor and Tailwind CSS. Just to kind of set the kind of level for this talk, I'm going to assume you know what Blazor is, and you've got an idea about how it works. I'm not going to do like a Blazor 101. What I'm going to do is kind of focus more on the Tailwind side of things. So maybe you've seen Tailwind, you're interested in trying it out, and you want to know a bit about how you can use that alongside Blazor. So before we go any further with this, I'll just quickly introduce myself. My name is Chris. I'm a software developer at a startup called Deployed. Fun fact, we're using Blazor and Tailwind in our application. We have been using it now for a couple of years. We use both Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. And we found this to be a very productive combination of technologies. So that's why I really want to share that with you today. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I wrote a book as well that got published this year called Blazor in Action. That I spent the last couple of years on. And I also do some open source work. So I have some packages under an organization called Blazor. And again, nice little milestone recently, we just passed 6.2 million downloads. So that's quite cool, and it's nice to see that Blazor is getting more popular. So that's enough about me. Let's kind of get into the meat of this straight away. So we've got quite a lot to get through. So let's start with the basic question. What is Tailwind CSS? Well, Tailwind CSS is a utility-based CSS framework. So what does it mean to be a utility-based CSS framework? Well, with Tailwind, what we do is we apply small, focused CSS classes that usually have a single responsibility and target a single CSS property. What we do is we compose these together to create an individual look and a certain style in our application. Now, that might not make the most sense when I explain it that way, so let's give a little contrast to a well-known framework called Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a component-based CSS framework. So with Bootstrap, you go to Bootstrap docs, you go and look what they have available. They have things like cards and buttons and alerts and all these kinds of things. You can take a chunk of markup with certain CSS classes, put it in your application, and you get that look straight into your app. So for example, you want a primary button. Well, you're going to go and create an HTML button, and then you're going to add a class of BTN, BTN primary, or BTN secondary, or whatever type of button you want. You can do cards, alerts, all this kind of thing. That's, like I say, that's not the same as Tailwind, because one of the limitations of frameworks like Bootstrap is that, well, everything ends up looking the same. I mean, I think it's probably fair to say most of us can spot a Bootstrap website from a mile away, and that doesn't mean that's a bad design or anything like that. But if you do want something that's a bit more unique, then you have to start customizing it. So if you've ever tried to create a custom version of Bootstrap, it can be a little fiddly. It's not terrible, but you've got to go and get the source Sass files, you've got to set up a build pipeline, you've got to tweak the right styles, or the other option is that you just leave Bootstrap as it is and then override lots of stuff in your application CSS file. And that can be a bit of a pain. But Tailwind allows you to tailor things much, much more easily. One of the other great benefits of Tailwind is the speed of development. So with Tailwind, because you're using these pre-built atomic CSS classes, you don't flip between files. You're not writing CSS in a style sheet 1 minute and then back in your markup applying it. Then you maybe go over to the browser to check what it looks like and then back to your CSS to tweak it and back to your markup to change some elements around or something like that. You're just doing everything directly in your markup. Now, some people don't like this, and that's fair enough. I can understand that. I thought it was a bit weird when I first started using Tailwind. But I haven't found anything that's close to the productivity that you get from that as a developer. The other interesting thing with Tailwind is that you almost never write CSS, which is kind of interesting when we're using CSS framework. But I'm going to make a little promise to you today. We've got about 40-ish minutes of demos. I'm not going to write any CSS during this at all, okay? I'm going to skirt that slightly. I'm going to come close, but I will certainly not write any CSS properties during this demo. So let's have a look at a practical example of this. So here's a card from Bootstrap, okay, and the markup that goes alongside it. So you can see there we've got this outer div with a class of card, and then this image card top class for the image, card body, card title, card text, okay? So we copy and paste that from Bootstrap docs, and that is what you're going to get in your application. So how would we do this with Tailwind? So this is actually the same card, but it's now using Tailwind's utility classes instead. So it looks a bit different. So let's work through this together so we can kind of get a bit of a shared understanding of how this all works. So on that outer div, we've got 3 classes, flex, flex colon, shadow LG. So flex is saying that we want to use flexbox for layout. Flex col is the direction of that flexbox. So we're saying here all the child elements are going to be stacked in a column. And then we've got shadow LG, because if you look at that card there, it's got a little shadow underneath it, and that's where that shadow is coming from. The image, rounded T and H40. So rounded top is because it's got slightly rounded top corners, and H40 is to do with the height. Okay, and now 40 doesn't actually map to a pixel value or a rem value. It doesn't mean a pixel value or rem value here. It maps to a value in Tailwind's design system. And this is a very important thing to understand about how Tailwind works. And we're going to look at the design system a bit more in a second. We've got P4, that's padding 4. And because there's no other characters in there, it means we're padding all the way around evenly, top, bottom, left, and right. Text gray 800, again, this is the text color, and it maps to a value in the design system. So this is gray and a shade of 800. Then that final P tag, we've got text-based. Technically, we don't actually need that. That's just saying use the default font size for the document, and that would happen by default. I've kind of just been a bit overly verbose here for the sake of the talk. So hopefully, what I want you to take from this is that there's a slight learning curve here with learning Tailwind's naming convention, but once you learn it, you can effectively understand how every element is styled just by scanning through your markup. And this is where that productivity starts to come in. Okay? It's very, very quick to make changes with Tailwind because you see everything right in front of you. You can just tweak those classes around and sort of see an instant result. Now, I mentioned about a design system. So Tailwind CSS is essentially one big design system, right? When we get into demos, you'll see that every style sheet that comes from Tailwind is actually compiled, okay? And it's compiled based on values that are in this design system. And it's completely configurable. You can change it, tweak it to whatever you want it to do. Now, this has got a lot of value because if you, say, work with a design team in your company, you can encode your company's design language into your Tailwind config, which makes life a lot easier for developers when they're going to use styles because they're all going to match whatever your company's design system is. So that's very useful. It is also possible to break out of that design system. So some people don't sort of realize that about Tailwind, but if there are certain occasions, and we do get this when we're building UIs, that you need an extra pixel movement here or there. You can break out of that design system and do ad hoc styles as well with Tailwind. It supports that. But like I said, it is compiled. So Tailwind, as of version 3, which is the current version, now uses a JIT compiler to compile your outputted CSS file. So it takes an input CSS file, and then it goes through the Tailwind JIT compiler, and out comes the actual production one that you're going to use. We're going to see that in action when we go into the demos in a little bit. But just as a quick kind of idea of like the type of things that we're going to get out of the box with Tailwind, we've got a very rich color palette by default. There's about 22 colors that ship with Tailwind by default, and they all come in this scale. So they all start at a shade of 50 and go up to 900. So you get a really good color palette to start off with. And this can be either replaced or extended depending on what your need is. So this color palette is taken by the JIT compiler, and it's a load of sort of color-relevant utility classes are generated from it. So, for example, we saw this earlier with the text gray 800. So we could say the text color, and this is text purple 700 on a P tag. But we can do things like backgrounds as well. So BG gray 100 is background gray 100. Okay. Another thing we have by default, which is very useful, is a constrained spacing system. Okay? So this can be a real pain if you've ever worked on big applications that are across multiple teams. You kind of end up getting this horrible CSS eventually where somebody's got a padding of 10, someone's got a padding of 9, someone's got a padding of 11, and these odd pixel values can sort of make everything look a little strange over time. With Tailwind, we've got a constrained system. So we saw it earlier, that H40. So that will map to a base pixel and base rem value by default, but again, you can change that there and change what it is. By default, it's a proportionate system, so it's quite easy to use. And what that means is essentially that 8 is double 4. Okay, so as a developer, if you look at something that's not got enough space, okay, well, I'll double the number, I'm going to double the space. It's quite easy to kind of iterate. So this is used for all kinds of utilities that are size related, so padding, margins, width, height, things like that, okay? And then finally, variants. And this is how we can do some more fancy things, I guess, if you want to put it that way. This is things like hover effects. This is odd-even effects on rows. You can target first and last children. You can apply dark mode styles. And again, we'll actually look at dark mode as well a little bit later on in the talk. But that basically variants in Tailwind map to pseudo classes and pseudo elements in CSS, essentially. That's what they're there for. So on a button, for example, if we want a hover effect, we can say that by default we want a background of red 500, which is BG red 500. But on hover, we just stick hover in front of that, and then we say what we want it to change to. So BG red 800, and that's our hover effect. And then the other example there is a dark mode. So by default, in light mode, we're going to do BG white, but when it's dark mode, we're going to do BG gray 800. Okay? But like I mentioned, all this stuff is completely configurable. Okay, so Tailwind defines this JavaScript object, and you can override bits, you can extend bits, however you want that to work, and completely configure it to your own taste. So this bit of code that you can see on the screen right now, that's replacing the default color palette. Okay, so I'm going in that colors object, and I'm just replacing all of those 22 default colors there with these specific ones. So these are the only ones that are going to be available in my application. I could extend it if I wanted to, but in this case, I'm just replacing them. So what this means is really we can think of utility frameworks as essentially Lego blocks. It's a good analogy for them. We can put things together in any random shape and configuration we want, and if we don't like something about it, we can just swap out one block for another one. Okay, now anybody who's either new to Tailwind or possibly has some preconceptions is going to start getting twitchy at this point, and we're going to have this conversation, all right? These are just inline styles, aren't they, Chris? These are evil. We got rid of these back in the early 2000s. These are terrible. Why are we doing this? I can understand why people feel this way. When you first see Tailwind, and I was one of these people, I was exactly the same. So let's just remind ourselves of why we don't tend to prefer inline styles. And I say prefer because, like everything in programming, they do have their place and they do have their use. But limitations of inline styles, they're basically magic numbers, magic strings, whatever you're happy to do. So you're going to define a style tag on an element. You're going to type out a style and put a value in it. And then that is fixed to that element. And if you want it somewhere else, you either rewrite it or copy and paste it, and then it's somewhere else. And then you need to change it. And this is where it all goes horribly wrong, because you now have to go and find everywhere where these hard-coded styles are and replace them. Okay? And that's not good. But I've already explained this. Tailwind uses a design system. Values map to configuration in that design system, which means if we want to change something, we can change it in the design system and not have to necessarily change classes in our markup. Pseudo-states, things like hover, focus, odd even, things like that, they're not available in inline styles. It's just not a supported thing. So if you want to do any kind of more interesting UI work, well, you're out of luck. But again, we've already seen that Tailwind supports this. We can do those effects. We have variants. And finally, media queries. It's quite a big one in modern web UI. If you want any kind of responsive design, if you want your apps to work well on iPads and mobile devices and what have you, then inline styles are not going to work for you, okay, because they're just not supported. But again, Tailwind does support these things, okay? There's variants for these. And that is all because Tailwind is still using CSS classes. They're just very, very focused. They're single responsibility. They're a single CSS property, okay? Now, there are still other trade-offs. I'm going to address some of this stuff in the demo. But I hope with that, I've kind of started to move you away from the idea that this is just inline styles. So let's start bringing Blazor into the equation and how we actually use Tailwind and get it into our application. So there's a couple of options here. So we're going to start off with option 1, which is the Tailwind Play CDN. So this is something that came out with Tailwind v3, or was greatly improved with Tailwind v3 is the correct way to put this. And it's a very, very good way to get up and running with Tailwind quickly and play around with it and find out if you just like it, if it's the kind of framework that will work for you. So in order to integrate Tailwind using the Play CDN, it's really simple. So we add a script tag referencing the Play CDN, and then you just start writing your inline style. Oh, Freudian slip there, wasn't it? This is start writing your utility classes into your code, and that's just going to work. Now, what's happening under the hood here is that little bit of JavaScript that we're referencing. That's basically scanning your DOM, finding whenever you use one of these utility classes, and it's going to create a dynamic style element in the head of that page and fill it up with the relevant CSS that you're using. Okay, so it's kind of going to do that in the background. If you view source on the page while you're doing this, you can see it sort of filling up. But what's really cool about the CDN is you don't lose any of that configurability that we talked about with having a design system. So if you want to customize it, you still can. So you can add in a script tag, you can create this Tailwind config object, and you can just start customizing it as if you would do with local development. So this is quite a powerful thing. You can really test all of the features of Tailwind CSS using the Play CDN. You can even use plugins. So Tailwind has a rich plugin ecosystem, both first-party and third-party community plugins. Now, the Tailwind Play CDN does only support the first-class plugins, okay, the official ones. Hopefully, they'll change that in the future. But all you have to do is put a query string on that reference to the Play CDN, and then start referencing the plugins you want to use, and it will just work. So this is great to get up and going with Tailwind and try it out for a very low cost. However, this is not something you want to do in production, okay? You don't want to go, oh, well, this is really easy, and just go and put it in your production app. That's not a good thing. And hopefully you've kind of seen why. It's dynamically generating these styles. It's scanning your HTML. It's not really a great way of doing things. Okay, so this is a non-production method, and they're very clear in the documentation that this is a non-production method. So how do we use this? If we've decided that we want to go ahead with Tailwind, how do we put this in a real application? Well, we're going to use the Tailwind CLI to do that. Now, the Tailwind CLI is NPM-based. Now, some .NET people are not fans of NPM, okay? I understand that. But NPM is sort of where a lot of this stuff lives. And personally, I don't have a problem with it, but I get people do. So this could put you off. But Tailwind have actually released a standalone version of the CLI now. So you can actually go on the Tailwind GitHub page, you can go to releases, and under there you'll find a standalone executable that will run on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS, and you can use that, and you don't have to use any Node NPM stuff or what have you. You can just use that standalone executable if you want to. However, today I'm going to show you the version using NPM because personally I think it's a bit easier and I think it integrates better in things like CI pipelines and stuff like that, which I think is a bit more useful in sort of real world apps. Cool. So at this point, we're going to swap over to Visual Studio and try and get some of this stuff working. So let me just jump over here, and I just need to change my screen to duplicate. Cool. Aha, I can see you all now. This is lovely. Cool. So I have got a Blazor WebAssembly standalone application right here. I'm sorry if I blinded anyone with the light color. I normally use dark mode, but it tends to be for talks it's better. But so yeah, we've got a standalone Blazor WebAssembly application here. But I don't know about you. I've been doing Blazor for a very long time now, and I'm getting quite tired of the file new project template. So I've reimagined this with Tailwind CSS. I've tried to come up with something that's a little bit more interesting. So I've restyled a chunk of this. However, I haven't actually integrated Tailwind into this yet, because I thought we'll do this together and see what it's like. So let's get going. So first things first, I'm going to find the right window, which is that one I prepared earlier. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run a command. And this is going to generate us a Tailwind config file. So I'm going to use npx Tailwind CSS in it. Now, npx is like a more modern npm, really. I'm not going to get a local node modules folder or anything like that. It uses a central cache for my machine, and it's just a much nicer experience, okay? So that's the command we're using there. So I've done that, and now we've got our tailwind.config.js file. And this is a minimum configuration for Tailwind, all right? There's not a huge amount we have to do here by default. Everything kind of that we've talked about is kind of there. But we do need to make one slight change. So inside of this content property, this array, we do need to pass in the files that are going to contain Tailwind utility classes. And that's so that the CLI can monitor those files for the usage of those and regenerate our output CSS file. So let's do that. So we'll pop this in here. There we go. So what I'm saying here is monitor all of my Razor files and my HTML files. So all of my Blazor components and the host page, okay? So we'll get that in there. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a source CSS file. So I'm going to create a new folder here. We'll call that styles. And then I'm going to add a new style sheet. Ooh, there we go. There we go. So this is going to be our input style sheet. And we're just going to put 3 Tailwind directives in here. Now, Tailwind is going to pass these and basically create a whole heap of CSS from this. So it's going to do, in the base layer, it's going to do things like create CSS resets, so we've got standardization across browsers. Then it's going to add new utility classes that it uses, component class that it uses, and things. But essentially, this is going to expand quite rapidly when it goes through the Tailwind CLI. So we've got that set up now. Let's go back over, and we can run the next command. So we're going to say npm, and we're going to say Tailwind CSS. So we're going to use the CLI tool again, and we're going to define an input file, which is our styles app CSS, and an output file, which we're going to do to the www root folder css/app CSS like so. And I'm also going to stick --watch on the end there, and that's going to basically trigger the essentially like Tailwind's hot reload system. It's going to watch those files that we defined in that content array for the usage of Tailwind classes, and then it's going to regenerate every time we use them, okay? Now, if you're wondering why it takes this approach, it's because if you just let Tailwind generate all of the potential utility classes it could, it results in a file that's about 20 meg of CSS. Now, if you've ever tried to load a 20 meg CSS file into a browser, they're not particularly keen on it. They don't like it, they slow down quite rapidly, and it's not an enjoyable experience. So that's why the JIT compiler is so useful, because essentially when we're developing this application, we're going to be working with the same CSS file that will end up in production, okay? So it's quite a nice way to work. So you can see that's active there. It's rebuilt the first version. So let's go and have a look what we've got. So if we go in and open up our output file, you can see all of these styles that it's created. So we've got a load of reset stuff at the top here, and then if we scroll all the way down, we start getting into the utility classes, okay? So these are some of those utility classes, and as I said, they each target a specific CSS property. So the reason there's some in here already is because, like I said, I've already put some styling in here because I don't want to sort of bore you typing all this stuff out. So that's that file, and now the last thing we need to do is go to our index.html and just add a reference to that output file, okay? So pop that in, and we are done. That is Tailwind set up in our application and ready to go for development. So let's save that, and let's go have a look at what we've got. So we'll run this application. Cool. And this is our reimagined Blazor template. So it's not looking too impressive at the moment. It definitely needs a bit more work, but the point is we haven't got a purple gradient down the left-hand side, which is the important part. So I've done a little bit of styling here, but we're going to build out a few bits so we can get a feel for what it's like to use Tailwind in a real application. So that hello world and welcome to my new app is looking very small. The hello world is actually an H1 tag, so that should probably be a little bit more prominent. So let's go in and do a bit of work and see what we can do with this. So I'm going to open up my index component here. You can see I've got no styling on this H1 or this P tag. So let's have a go at what we can do here. So first of all, we're going to say we want the font to be extra bold, okay? Because we want something to be a little bit more punchy. So go back, we've now got extra bold. It stands out a bit more, but it's quite small. So let's try and make it a bit bigger. So we can say, well, let's make the text 7XL, so much, much bigger. Okay, cool. Now we've got something that looks far more like a header than it did before. So lastly, we'll go in and we'll say, right, we're going to put the tracking as wide, which will just space and it always does that. It'll space the letters out a little bit. And then we're going to say, as the final one, we'll put a margin bottom of 6 on it, just to put a bit of space between that and the paragraph tag. So save that, go back, and now we've got our styled H1 tag. Okay, so that was pretty straightforward. We can do the same thing for this P tag down here. So this is going to be a little bit probably less dramatic. So this one we'll just say, right, we'll have text XL to start off with, and we'll put a margin bottom of 20 on this one. Put a big gap there. So we'll save that, go back. Little bit more interesting, but not much, okay? But you can see kind of from that, hopefully, that styling standard elements is a pretty quick process, okay? You just tap, 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 save, and especially when you're having a good day with hot reload, it comes through quite fast. So that's good. It's not really that impressive, so let's try and do something a little bit more visual and a little bit more interesting. So we've got this panel on the right-hand side there. It's looking a bit bland, but we want to make this stand out a bit, give the page a bit of pop. So something that I've done a lot in CSS is gradients and things like that, and I don't know why, but it's one of those syntaxes that no matter how many times I do it, I end up on Stack Overflow or Mozilla Docs or whatever, trying to remember what the syntax is for doing a gradient. So we'll have a look at what that looks like in Tailwind. So this is the markup that actually handles that panel. So we're going to add a few classes to this. So let's pop them in. So what I've done here is I've added the following 3 classes. BG gradient to BR. So I'm going to want a background gradient, and I'm going to want it to go to the bottom right, which means it's going to start in the top left. And then I want it to go from green 400 to blue 500. Okay? So that's starting color and end color. Save that, swap over, I've got a gradient. Okay? So really easy to kind of get these effects in, okay? If I was doing this with regular CSS, I'd jump over to my CSS file, I'd define a class, I'd Google, I would find out the correct syntax, I would paste the code, I would change around the values, I would come back, and then I would have a gradient. On my best day, I cannot do it that quickly, okay? There's probably some of you who could, fair play, but for me, this was quite a revelation. And we can kind of do stuff as well that's a little bit more interesting. And so we could say, like, OK, well, when I'm hovering, then I'm going to go from blue 500 instead. And then on hover, I'm going to go to green 400, like so. So save that, go back. And now I've got a nice effect when I hover over. OK? So I can do sort of these things quite easily. It's quite simple with these utility classes. Okay, so yeah, that's not too bad. It's a little bit interesting, but let's look at something more advanced again. Let's start playing around with transforms. Okay, so we want to move elements around in the DOM and sort of move them about a bit. We're going to rotate something. Okay, so in this shared components folder, I've got the survey prompt that's on the default template. That's actually this sort of kind of sorry-looking bit of text down here, and that definitely should stand out more. It's a survey prompt, after all. So let's go in here, and the first thing we're going to do is add some initial styles so it looks a bit more interesting, drags a bit more attention, okay? So that's cool, but everything's very square on this page and everything, so we want to rotate it slightly, make it look a bit more like it's a banner been pasted on there, okay? Let's go in, and we're going to say, transform, rotate 3. And I've been able to skew that element, okay? Again, this is one of these syntaxes that I don't know for everyone else, but certainly for me, it's just one of those things that just never quite stick, so I don't do it, I'm not doing this every single day, rotating elements and bits and bobs, so it's just one of those things that just is a lot easier with Tailwind. I can just do that, quick, snap, and it's done. Cool. So that's a little bit about the basic usage. Now, again, skeptics among us is probably sitting here and thinking a few things. Firstly is what you're telling me, Chris, I'm going to have to go to every H1 tag and P tag in my application and copy and paste those styles. That doesn't sound very useful. Fair point. I definitely agree with that. And actually, if we go back to the application, there's another problem. We've got this panel on the right-hand side here that actually exists, again, on the counter page and the fetch data page. But it's not styled, because, again, we'd have to copy all that stuff across. So we've kind of got two problems here. We've got styling of repeated native elements, and we've got repetition of markup with styles, okay? So we've got a couple of ways we can deal with this. So let's tackle the native HTML element first. So things like H1 tags, P tags, list elements probably, anchor tags, those sort of things. They're things that you kind of style once for your application, and you just want that to be everywhere. You don't want to have to repeat that. So that's cool, we can do that. So what we can do is we can hop over to our input style sheet, and we can go and define something for the H1. So I can say, right, for this H1, I want to apply some styles. Now, this is where I'm going to remind you that I did promise you I'd not write any CSS properties, and I'm going to keep my promise, okay? So I'm going to use something called apply. It's another directive from Tailwind, okay? Now, when I do apply, I'm going to do this just to save typing, I can use those same utility classes in my input file. Remember, this is all going to get passed by Tailwind CLI, so it's going to convert them in the same way it would do if I used them in my markup. So I can move all my styles from my H1 into this central location. I can do the same thing for the P tag. So I can come in here, and again, I can say apply, and we'll pop those styles in there as well. And then if I go back to my component, my index component, and we'll get rid of the styles from the H1 tag here, and we'll do it from the P tag down here as well. We'll save that, go back to the app, and you can see that nothing's changed, which is good. Except if I now go across my different pages, all of my H1s and my Ps are now being styled in the same way because it's coming from that central location. This is a misconception that I think people have about utility-based frameworks, which is you must always put everything in the markup. That's not true. That is not going to be efficient, okay? When you do have genuine repetition like this, these tools are there to help you refactor things to make it more maintainable. So that's one problem we've hopefully solved. The next one is this whole chunk of markup, okay? Now, we could do a similar thing. We could go define some classes in our input file, but there's actually a different way that we can deal with this when we're using something like Blazor, okay? Component frameworks like Blazor, React, Vue, all these component-based SPA frameworks, they've solved this problem. It's, components are the way forward. We can move all of this repetition into a component and then just reference the component across the various pages. So, and that's the way we can solve this problem. So if I create a new component here, and I'll call this Tailwind, and then I'm just going to basically pop in the markup from before. So this is the same markup that's repeated across those other pages. So we'll save that. Hot Reload is going to want to rebuild this. And while it's doing that, we're going to go in here, and we're going to just reference our new Tailwind component. So we'll do that, and we'll just repeat that across the other pages. So where are we? Down here on the fetch data page. And we'll do the same thing here on the counter page. Get rid of that as well. So we'll save that. We'll go back over to our application. Everything looks the same as it did before, except now we've got the same style across all of our pages, okay? So going to utility frameworks does not mean that you throw away the ability to centralize styling or anything like that, okay? It's more about being able to rapidly prototype what you want things to look like in the markup and then doing the refactor when you see the repetition. Very similar to how you would do with any other language. If you're writing something in the back end in your API, you're going to get a first version in, get it working, then iterate on it, make it cleaner, make it better. And you can do the same thing with Tailwind. Cool. So that's hopefully kind of allayed some fears around the maintenance of Tailwind applications and things like that. So let's try and push things a little bit. Let's try and make this a little bit more interesting. So let's talk about animations, right? Most applications that have any form of rich UI are going to have some form of animation going on. So how can we use Blazor and Tailwind together to create animations that don't need us to go and use JavaScript, all right? Well, we're going to build a component that is going to do that for us today. And what we're going to do, if we go back to our web page here, we're going to have that panel component slide in from the right-hand side when you first load on the page, just to give it a little bit more pop when you first land. It's only going to do it once. We don't want to, make people angry. But we're just going to set that up and see what that's like to do. So to start off with, I'm going to create a new component. And this component is going to be called slide in, imaginatively named. And let's look at some initial markup for this. So I'm bringing in system timers here. I'm going to use a timer to do this. I've also got iDisposable because someone on YouTube called me out for not disposing of this in this talk in a previous version. And I don't want to be an irresponsible developer, so please dispose your disposable things. So it's there. And then we've got this child content parameter, okay? And that's there because we're going to wrap this component around whatever thing we want animated. In this case, it's going to be wrapped around that Tailwind component we created earlier. So how is this actually going to work? Well, we're going to use that transform that we saw earlier and transition effects from CSS in order to do this, and Tailwind's classes. So what we're going to start off with is some base styles on this div here. So this div, the h-full is just going to say take up the maximum space or whatever your parent is. The transition, duration, and transform classes are the key ones that we've just put in there. So transition duration is basically going to allow us to say any CSS properties we change the value of, transition that value over a period of time. And in this case, we're transitioning it over a period of 500 milliseconds. And that's what's going to help us create an animation effect. The transform is going to be used in a similar way that we saw earlier. So transform is used when you want to move elements around sort of spatially, if you want to put it that way. And we're going to use it to push that element off the side of the page when it first renders and bring it back. Okay? So they're kind of there to set that up. The next thing we need to do is add some styles to this animation styles field. This is something we're going to update dynamically when we need to create the animation effect. So the first sort of default styles that we're going to have it use are translate x full and opacity 0. So translate x full is going to take whatever the child content is and push it its full width off to the right. Okay, so in our case, it's going to push it off the page. We're going to say opacity 0 as well because we're going to want it to be invisible. It's still going to take up space in the DOM. It's not going to make things jump around, but it's just going to be invisible. So that's what's going to happen by default. So next thing we're going to do is add some code into this on initialized. So this is just going to set up the timer. Okay, so we're going to set up a timer here with a delay of 300 milliseconds. It's not going to repeat itself. We've got auto reset set to false. And whenever it elapses, we're going to call this trigger animation method. But we haven't got that yet, so let's pop that in so we can see what that's going to do. So that did not format. There we go. So the trigger animation method is kind of where the magic starts to happen. It's going to update that animation styles field with some new values. It's going to use translate x0 and opacity 100. Now, the key thing to understand here is that we're still we're manipulating the same CSS properties under the hood. And that's where that transition duration kicks in. Okay? So we're going to go from translate x full to translate x0, which basically means bring it back to wherever it was originally meant to render. And then we're going to turn the opacity all the way back up to 100. But that's all going to happen over a duration of 500 milliseconds. And this is where the animation effect comes in. All right? So the last thing we need to add in here is the onAfterRender method. And this is going to only trigger on the first render of this component. Because like I said, we don't want this sort of zipping in and out constantly. You know, we don't want to, you know, really, like I say, annoy people. So all we're going to do is start the timer on the first render, and then it's going to run once, and then it will stop. So that's all we need for our animation component. So let's go and use that now. So if we go over to our index page, we're just going to wrap this Tailwind component there. Like so. If we save that, go back to our app, and there is our animated component in action. Okay, so that's slid in from the left, and if we go back, you can see that happening over and over again, just sliding in nicely. Okay, we've been able to create that effect just mashing technologies from Blazor and Tailwind together. Now, the eagle-eyed among you may notice that there's a problem with this. Okay, if you keep an eye at the bottom of the screen there, you will see that for a fraction of a second, we have a horizontal scroll bar. Okay, so that's not great. That's the browser trying to be helpful. It's going, oh, you pushed this off the viewport, so you probably want to get to that, so I'll render you a scroll bar so you can get over there. But in this case, we don't want that to happen. So we can make a quick tweak to our host page. So inside here, we can say overflow x hidden. So save that. Go back over here. I'll do a reload. There you go. And that's got rid of that. So we've now got a nice, smooth transition going on. We've got this little bit of animation. And yes, admittedly, this isn't the kind of most complex animation in the world, but hopefully you can get an idea of what's possible. You know, you could easily extend this component to have parameters that will allow you to define which direction the animation is coming from, how long the animation should take, all those kinds of things. You could apply other animation effects as well. So you could have it swirling around or whatever you happen to think up, okay? But this is just to give you an idea of what's possible with these two technologies. Cool. So now we're getting on to the fun bit. We're going to talk about dark mode at this point. So just grab a drink. So dark mode is something that I'm a big fan of. Like I say, I normally have dark mode IDE and everything like that. So like I say, apologies if this is a bit bright. And it's something that's obviously quite popular in our industry. Like most applications now have a light mode and dark mode, and it's quite almost becoming a very important feature for people in their applications. So how can we bake this into our new Blazor file new project template? So let's have a look at that. Well, I'm going to just go into my browser here. I'm going to go to settings and appearance, and I'm going to set it to my system default. My system default is dark mode. So let me just do that. And voila. Thank you for coming for my talk. Goodbye. So this isn't Tailwind being super clever, all right? I want to be really upfront. Like, it's not like it's gone, oh, dark mode. Let me just flip everything around for you, and you can go have a coffee. That's not the case. So I've actually added in some dark mode variants ahead of time here, again, because you don't want to spend most of this talk watching me type those classes in. But I haven't styled this header. We're going to do that together. But the reason this has worked is because dark mode is enabled by default in Tailwind in V3 and V3 onwards. In V2, you had to turn it on because it created a lot of pseudo classes. And before the JIT compiler was the main way of doing things, it's really bloated the CSS file. So this is something that's only been turned on since V3. And it uses whatever your system preference is by default. Okay? But we're going to look at another way of doing that in a second. But just so we can see for ourselves what it's like to add dark mode classes, I'm going to go into the nav menu here. And if we look here, we can see we've got like BG white on that top header element. Okay, saying we want a white background. And we've got things like text purple for the active class on the nav link and things like that. So I'm going to update this code, and we can have a look at what's changed. So there's a few extra classes been put in. So every time we've got a default for light mode, there's now a dark mode alternative, okay, a dark mode variant. So here we're saying we want BG white by default, but if we're in dark mode, we want BG gray 700 instead. And we've got the same here on these links. So text purple 800 by default, text purple 400 if we're in dark mode, okay? So if we save that, go back over to our app, and now we've got dark mode for our header, okay? So, and this is kind of across the whole app, so we can see like everything is still working. We've got all our other effects and everything going on. And our slide in. Okay, so this is looking all right so far. We've got a dark mode, we've got a light mode. This isn't really that great because no one's really likes just going into their browser settings and changing light mode and dark mode. That's a little bit clunky. And surely we could do something a little bit better and a little bit more interesting. Well, yes, we can. So wouldn't it be great if we had a toggle that we could let the user choose what they wanted? Okay, so let's build that out. Let's do that next. And to do that, we need to kind of look a bit more into how Tailwind does this dark mode. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make a change to the configuration file here. So in here, we can say dark mode, and then what I'm going to say here is class. So what I'm saying here is override the default version of dark mode. Like I said, dark mode by default is based on your system settings. What I'm saying here is base it on a class being present. So what's going to happen now is Tailwind is going to look for an element with a class of dark, and then any child elements will have their dark variants applied. Okay? So if we save that and go back to our app, we're back in light mode because that doesn't exist anymore. Okay? If we go into the host page, the index.html, and on the HTML element, we add a class of dark and save it, we've got dark mode again. So that's how the class version works. So this tells us what we need to do with our component. We need to programmatically add and remove that class from that element in order to be able to toggle this effect on and off. So now we understand how that's working, we can build a component in order to do that. So we're going to add a new component to start off with. And it's going to be called dark mode toggle. So let's have a look at what the initial code for this looks like. Now, there's a few bits in here, and we're going to work through this. Some stuff we don't need to care about just yet, like that IA sync disposable. We'll worry about that in a second. The local storage stuff, we'll worry about that in a second. And the JS runtime, we'll worry about that in a second. The block of markup there is just going to basically render a nice little toggle switch with light and dark either side of it so that we get a nice bit of UI. But the secret source, as it were, is this hidden input. Okay, this is quite a common technique when we're trying to create a little bit more sort of pizzazz to our visual elements. So we've got a hidden input, and what happens is every time we click on this kind of nice UI toggle, behind the scenes it's going to trigger the on change on that. And that's going to give us a programmatic hook to be able to react to whatever the user's choice is. And that's that toggle theme handler down there, and we haven't filled that out yet. But before we go any further, let's just save that, and we're going to go into our nav menu, and we're going to go look at what that actually looks like. So we've got dark mode toggle. Save that. So this is what we've, let me zoom in. So this is what we've got here. This is our new toggle. So like, looks half decent, hopefully. And what we're going to do is as the user clicks on this, we'll slide that back and forth, and we'll make light. If we're in light mode, light will be a little bit lighter, and dark will go darker, and all this kind of stuff. So there's also going to be some really kind of cheesy Star Wars joke in a minute. I apologize now. So let's try and hook this up, because at the moment it doesn't actually do anything. Now, as we saw, we need to add and remove that dark class from the HTML element. Now, the HTML element isn't something we can get to in Blazor by default. Blazor's application boots up in an element much lower down the DOM structure, and we can't get out there using C# alone. So we are going to have to use a bit of JavaScript in order to do this. So that's the thing that we're going to do first. So I'm going to add in a new JavaScript file. And we'll scroll down here to do JavaScript file. And this is going to have a very specific name. So we've got the same name as the component, but with .js on the end. Okay, and this is using Blazor's JS isolation feature. So this means that we can put our JavaScript alongside the component that's using it. I really love this. I like having things that change together next to each other. Big fan of vertical slice and feature folders and things like that. So this is something that makes me very happy. So now we've got that in place, we're going to go in and add the code for that. So we're going to, this is using JavaScript modules under the hood. So we're going to export this function, set theme, and all that's going to do is react to a string that's being passed in. So if the string is dark, then we're going to add the dark class, and if it's light, then we're going to remove the dark class. All right? Hopefully pretty straightforward stuff. We're not going to worry about that too much, and we're going to close that because we don't need to care about that anymore. Okay? Let's get back to our component now and try and wire some of this stuff up. So what we need to do now is we need to get access to that JavaScript module that we've just created. So let's have a look at doing that. So the first thing we're going to do is set up this IJS object reference type. Okay, so this is something we use in Blazor to get a handle on something in JavaScript, so we can call it from our C# code. So we've got that set up, and that's going to be a reference to that module. And then in the on-after-render method here, we're using the JS runtime that was injected at the top, this thing up here, and we're using that to call into JavaScript to get a handle onto that module. To do that, we're using a special keyword as the first argument called import. And then it's just a path to that file, okay, to that module. Now, what's really cool about this JS isolation feature is that will only download that JavaScript file if we go to this component, okay? So in this case, it's on every page, so it will happen every time. But if you were using this on a application that only had JavaScript on a certain page, the user's only going to get that downloaded if they go on that page, and it's going to happen in the background. You're not going to have to care about it. We're not going to have to set up a reference to this in our host page or anything like that. Blazor is just going to take care of it for us. Lovely. So now we've got this in place. This is where we need to implement iasync disposable. See previous comment about being a responsible developer. So IJS object reference does need to be disposed. If you don't do this, you can cause memory leaks and things like that. So we're going to implement that next. Okay, and we're just going to say, if the theme module isn't null, then we're just going to call dispose async on that, and that will tidy that up nicely. Then we've got this toggle theme class. We're going to update that now. So remember, this method is going to get called every time the user clicks on that toggle, okay, and every time they want to change it. So that args value that comes in, that's going to give us access to whatever the value is of that checkbox, that hidden checkbox, true or false. So depending on what that is, we're going to set up a string, which is going to be either light or dark, and then we're going to use that theme module that we got a reference to in our on-after-render method to call into that set theme function that we export from that JavaScript module, and we're going to pass in that theme value, okay? And that will allow that to all work. So let's save that, go back to our app and see what we've got. So if we click up here, we can now see that we have got our working toggle, okay? So we've got all that set up and going, which is great. This is now a bit better. Users can decide what they want. You know, if they're having a day where they fancy light mode, they can use it. Otherwise, you know, you can keep it on dark mode, okay? So that's great. The downside of this is that if I set it to light mode and I refresh my page, it goes back to dark mode. So that's not ideal. That's not great. It would be much better if we could actually remember this preference so that people don't have to keep clicking it. So we can bring in local storage at this point. So we saw this was being injected earlier on, this iLocal storage service. So this is a shameless plug for one of my packages called Blazor Local Storage. It's basically a way to interop with browser local storage APIs using C#, okay? So we've got that injected there. So we need to do a couple of things. Firstly, when we toggle the theme, we need to store the value in local storage, okay? So that's the first thing we need to do. So we're just going to call into the set item as string async theme, and then save whatever the value is before we then call into the set theme function. So that's saving the value. The next thing we need to do is we need to read that value out when we first load the application so that we can make sure we put it back to where it was when the user last finished. So to do that, we're going to add a bit of code into the on-after-render method on the first load. And what we're going to say here is go into local storage and try and get the key called theme, if it exists. If it does, then we'll decide whether we're dark mode or light mode, and then we'll pass that into set theme, and everything should hopefully hang together. So it doesn't ever like that, so we'll just let that restart. Cool. So if we toggle this to light mode, it's light mode, and if we restart everything, it stays as light mode, okay? And if we go into the browser tools, we can see here we've got that theme key, and it's got a value of light, and as we toggle back and forth, you can see that happening, and obviously, as I said, when we refresh, it's persisted, okay? So hopefully this has been interesting. You've been able to see a few sort of more interesting and I would say more advanced features of using Tailwind and Blazor and how we can sort of create some nice effects using the two technologies together. So to finish this up, let's talk about how we actually take this into production. How would you go and deploy an app that's using Tailwind CSS? Because we've kind of got this locally running CLI going on. Like if we go back over here, you can see this has been nicely sort of churning away as we've been making changes, redoing the output CSS every time we've made changes. But we don't have this running in production. That would be terrible. So what's going on? Well, let's have a look at how we would actually make this into a production app. So I'm going to, first of all, cancel that CLI. And I'm going to go back over here to my application. Now, if we come up here, I'm going to go to the CS proj file, and to do this, we're going to use some targets for MS Build. So underneath this item group, I'm going to paste in a couple of targets. So the first one here at the top, this one, I'll just highlight it there. So this is check for NPM, okay? So this is more of just a kind of sanity check, really. This is going to check that inside of our build pipeline, build server, whatever it happens to be, that Node is available, because we are going to use npx commands in order to do this. So this is just going to fail the build if Node isn't present. So not overly exciting, but the one that is a bit more interesting is this one. This is that build CSS target. Now this is going to run before the compile step. We set an environment variable, node m for production. Tailwind looks for this in order to do some optimizations. And then we're going to run a command, npx tailwind CSS, an input file, an output file, so pretty much the same as what we had before, except at the end, instead of --watch, we've got --minify. Because the Tailwind CLI will minify our production CSS out of the box with just that flag added on, which is a nice touch. Okay? And this is only going to run in release mode, so we've got a condition on there to make sure that this doesn't interfere with developers when they're doing local development. So if we save that, we'll change over to release mode, we'll do a build, and let that go through. And we have now got, hopefully, a minified CSS file, okay? So it's gone through, we've got the same file that we've been using, and this is a very key thing to understand. We are using exactly the same file that we've been using all the way through development, okay? But it's now just reparsed it and minified it for us. So that's a really good thing, because, you know, let's face facts, we should always be as close to production at development time as we can be. So this is a really nice feature. So we can scroll across and we can see all of that minified file. Okay, so just as a recap here, we've gone through what Tailwind is. We've talked about some of the misconceptions about Tailwind, perhaps. We've talked about how we can get Tailwind up and running in our applications. We've looked at what it's like to use Tailwind as developers. We've been able to do some more advanced stuff, like animation effects. We've been able to implement dark mode with a toggle and save that so users can have that setting remembered. So hopefully this has been a good introduction to Tailwind. Hopefully I've piqued your curiosity if you were unsure about it and you're interested in trying it. The code that you've seen today is available on my GitHub. I've done this talk a few times, so I thought I'm not just going to create another repo for Oslo, so there's several versions that you can go and get off there. So other than that, that is, I think, everything from me. Thanks for watching. If you want to ask any questions, feel free to come down, but thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the conference.